welcome back to my channel. I hope you are all well. Today I'm going to be talking about what is dubbed or the Cat Lady case. It's a Canadian case that is still unsolved to this day. So I hope you enjoy my retelling as much as you can enjoy a true crime story. Before I begin, I just want to remind you to like and subscribe if you want. I make commentary and true crime content, so if you like that, please subscribe. Also, I want to credit Xander, who actually made a podcast about this case called Uncover the Cat Lady case. He's a Canadian writer and journalist, and most of my information that I'm presenting in this video is him, so I will link his podcast below. Let's get into it. In the span of a single year in the late 1990s, 4 seniors under the care of the Laan siblings went missing and are now all presumed dead. All 4 seniors were living on one of 3 poorly maintained properties that were owned by the Laan siblings at the time of their disappearances, and none of them have been heard from since. 3 of the 4 seniors were actually chronically ill and didn't have the capacity to leave or move on their own without assistance, so there's no way they could have left by their own free will by themselves. And the 4th was extremely afraid of her landlord. This is the story of the suspected deaths of Joan Lawrence, John Croft, John Assemple, and Ralph Grant, and the strange history of the Laan siblings. Dorothy Joan Lawrence, known just as Joan, which I will be referring to her throughout this video as, was born in Ottawa, Ontario in 1921 to her mother Irene Claire McCarthy, who was born in 1894, and her father William, who was born in 1887. The family was consistently middle class, which is proven by William owning his own house, and he always had a stable job even through the 1920s and the Great Depression. And so the family never seemed to struggle financially that we know of. Not much is known about Joan's early childhood because it was like almost 100 years ago, but by all accounts, she seemed to live a pretty normal, average, middle-class upbringing. She completed grade 13 and went on to work mostly in writing and journalism/media as an adult. After graduating, she worked as a reporter or journalist for some time for the Ottawa Journal and then the Montreal Standard, but appeared discouraged in this line of work because she said that journalism was a dying field. Joan was also a poet. Her first poem was published when she was only 19, and it was published by the Toronto Star. Her work was eventually published in other Canadian publications such as Chatelaine, Canadian author and bookman. She worked various jobs as an adult, but her true love always seemed to be writing, specifically her poetry. One of Joan's poems that was published in the Toronto Star in 1941 was titled The Little White Rose, and it reads, quote, "The window of the florist shop was gay, with flowers in an orderly array, but all alone one little white rose lay, forgotten in a dusty corner. There, no eye could see that it had once been fair, no ear could hear its wistful little prayer. It wept forlornly for the silver sheen of summer showers and the virgin green of laughing gardens it had never seen. The florist showed me orchids, phlox, and red carnations, but I only bought instead the little rose from which the bloom had fled. Out in the winter night it trembled, awed, baring its timid heart to gaze at God. Watching the stars that crowded close to nod a friendly message to its upturned face. The snow enshrouded in a misty lace. The kindly north wind slowed his rowdy pace to waft its willing petals far and wide. happy that it had been seen by the great outside. The little flower smiled at me and died. Joan eventually married an army lieutenant named Burton Gamble on Friday, December 24th, 1943 at St. Martin's Church in Montreal, Quebec. She would have been around 22 years old at the time that she was married. I am unsure about how old her husband was, but presumably around the same age, like in his 20s. Not much is known about their marriage and what actually caused their marriage to dissolve, but the couple eventually divorced in 1949. There is some speculation online that the dissolution of Joan's marriage was caused by the death of their young child, a son named Robert Gamble, though it's never been actually proven that Joan ever had any children, so this is just speculation. But the speculation comes from a poem that Joan got published in 1971 that was titled "Oh Bob," and in the poem she talks about her losing an estranged or lost or deceased son and the grief that comes with losing someone so important to you and so young. There was also a potential relative of Joan that had, below Joan and her husband, they had on their family tree a son named Robert Gamble, who was born in 1944, which would have been a year after Joan was married, and then passed away at around 5 years old in 1949, which is when the couple divorced. This is not known, and by all accounts, Joan could not have actually had a son, but it is possible because a lot is unknown about Joan's early life or even adult life before she moved to Muskoka. So Joan's last known poem that was actually published was called Birdbath Runway, and it was published in 1972. She would have been around 50 or 51 years old at this time. It was reported that Joan moved to Toronto with her parents when she was around 26 years old, which would have been around 1947 when she was still legally married to her now ex-husband. I would assume the couple had started separating at this time, which is why she moved to Toronto with her parents, seemingly without him, or he could have been away at war and she moved away. It's very unclear, but it seems like Joan was trying to get a fresh start in her mid-20s by moving to Toronto. After moving to Toronto with her parents, Jonah worked at some various advertising firms, though I'm unclear of what her position was, but she was eventually fired from an advertising firm because she was, quote, writing a book when she was supposed to be working. After this brief stint in advertising, it appears that Joan primarily worked as a freelance writer where she got her poems and some short stories published in various Canadian magazines and newspapers. As an adult, Joan was said to enjoy cross-country skiing, downhill skiing, and cycling, so it appears that she was very active as an adult. In the 1970s, Joan was said to be still living with her parents. She would have been in her 50s at the time. She was still living with her parents because they were both in poor health, so she was taking care of them in their last few years of life. Her parents both eventually passed away in the 1970s, and Joan moved on with her life. It is unclear why Joan actually became estranged from her extended family outside of her parents. She had no siblings that I know of. There is some speculation that the estrangement was caused by a property dispute, like Joan was supposed to inherit some sort of property after a relative passed, but it went to someone else, so this may have been what caused their estrangement, but it's widely unknown. But her extended relatives say they last heard from her sometime in 1976 when she sent them a postcard with no return address on it. After the death of her parents, it is said that Joan moved to Barrie, Ontario for a little while, while, but by the 1980s, she had moved to Muskoka, Ontario alone. Muskoka is largely known as Ontario's cottage country, so a significant amount of residents there are actually part-time. There are people that own cottages there and only really come up to that land during the summertime when the weather is better and they can do like outdoor activities. There is still a significant population that is full-time, and there is a lot of poverty and various things happening in Muskoka for full-time residents. Joan's first actually legally confirmed residence is in 1984. Muskoka locals quickly became familiar with Joan like around the late 1980s because of her sort of eccentric outwards appearance. She wore second-hand clothes from the local Salvation Army. She usually wore a skirt, a scarf, and a page boy hat. She was said to wear a scarf all year round despite the weather changes. She was often seen hitchhiking and carrying grocery bags from the local A&P grocery store, which A&P is now a defunct Canadian grocery store chain. Her grocery bags were often filled with cat food, so she became known by the locals as the cat lady. After Joan moved to Muskoka, she noticed that there was a lot of stray cats around, so she started taking them in and taking care of them. By the time of her disappearance in 1998, it was said that Joan was looking after more than 30 cats. She was friendly and talked quite a bit to many of the Huntsville locals where she lived, but it's said that she never opened up about her life prior to moving to Muskoka, specifically Huntsville, and she never spoke about her family. While living in Huntsville, Joan spent many years living in a small house or like a shack type thing with no running water, but this house was accidentally burnt down by Joan in 1994. It's reported that Joan had a stack of newspaper beside her wood stove in her small house, and one day the newspapers accidentally caught on fire and the whole house was burned down. After this tragedy, Joan sort of bounced around a little bit and didn't have a permanent place to stay for a couple of years. She would live sometimes in shelters run by the Salvation Army and in various boarding homes. While she didn't have a secure housing, her beloved cats lived in the woods, and it's said that Joan would visit them basically every day to make sure they were well taken care of and fed. In 1996, it's said that Joan moved into the attic of the Cedar Pines Christian Retirement Home, which was a care home in Huntsville, I think, that was for the chronically ill and elderly, which was run by the Laan siblings, who I will tell you a lot about a little bit later in this video. She actually complained to one of the siblings that owned the home, which was Catherine Laan, that the rent at the home was too high and it was eating up basically all of her monthly income. At the time, Joan was receiving around $900 per month in benefits and old age security from the Canadian government. She lived pretty much paycheck to paycheck at this time, so it was very significant that she basically couldn't afford anything else like food and stuff outside of the rent she was paying to live at this retirement home. And since most of her monthly income was going to her rent at the retirement home, she didn't have enough money really to pay for food for her cats, which would have been really significant for her because they were like her children. After Joan complained, Catherine told her that she had another cheaper place for Joan to live, and this was basically in a small garden shed on another one of the properties owned by the Laan siblings. So Joan agreed that she would pay $600 a month in rent to live in an 8x10 garden shed. She moved from the retirement home to the garden shed in 1997. While living in the shed, she used her remaining money, which was around $300, to take care of her many cats. So most of her own food was actually from a local food bank. The property she was moved to was actually owned by the Laan family, which in this case is comprised of 4 siblings. So it's Catherine Laan and then her 3 brothers, David, Walter, and Paul Laan. So it's known as the Laan family farm. The siblings actually inherited this plot of land or property from their parents. Joan's living conditions on the Laan family farm were disgusting and deplorable. It was inhumane how she was living. The shed had no heating, no electricity, no running water, and no bathroom, and she was still paying $600 per month to live there. So the property itself is fairly large. On the property, there is the main house, which is a farmhouse where the siblings' uncle, a man named Uncle Ron, actually lived and worked on as the farm's caretaker. Then scattered around the rest of the property, there were little like cabins, sheds, and outbuildings that the Laan family sometimes rented out to lower income elderly people around Huntsville and Muskoka, people that were highly vulnerable and couldn't really afford a place to live at the time, like Joan Lawrence, who desperately needed somewhere to stay, so their standards for living were low and they were exploited by the Laan family, in my opinion. There was also reportedly discarded junk littered all over the property, so there were dozens of abandoned vehicles all down the driveway and around the farmhouse, and there were also many discarded water heaters on the property. No one seemed to take care of this property properly and clean it. Joan had rented out the 8x10 garden shed, as I said, which was located to the rear of the main farmhouse and was near a lake. Another renter or tenant on the property was a 57-year-old man who was a former limo driver. His name was Alan Marshall, and he reportedly moved to Muskoka from Toronto in 1997. Alan lived in a cabin on the farm property closer to the road. Joan and Alan became acquaintances throughout their time both living on the Laan family property. He would later say that Joan would always say hi to him when she saw him on the property, and often when she went into town, into Huntsville, to the grocery store, she would always pick him up caramel bars and give them to him when she returned. After he hadn't seen Joan on the property for a few weeks, Alan started becoming concerned about Joan's safety. So on Wednesday, November 25th, 1998, he told his probation officer, because Alan was on probation at that time, so he told his probation officer, a lady named Sandra Gordon, that he was concerned for Joan's safety because he hadn't seen her in around 3 weeks at that time, which he said was out of character for Joan, especially since her cats were living on the property and she would never have left them behind. So based on this information, Sandra decided to report Joan missing to the OPP, which is the Ontario Provincial Police. So on Saturday, November 28th, 1998, so around 3 days after it was initially reported, 28-year-old sort of rookie detective Aaron Burke, who worked for the OPP at the time, was assigned to work Joan's missing persons case. Since Joan was an adult and was free to leave the Laan property without notice at any time, without any legal repercussions. Erin began her investigation by calling around 2 local motels in the area to see if Joan had just left without telling anyone and was living there. She sadly wasn't. None of the motels had reported seeing or booking a room for Joan. Then Erin received a tip that Joan had actually been working on a case with a local law clerk who worked at a local Huntsville law firm. Joan had been working with this law clerk on a criminal fraud case that Joan was going to take to the OPP, or had recently taken to the OPP shortly before her disappearance. Joan believed that her landlord, which later was found out to be Uncle Ron, she believed that he had taken her 1997 income tax check, which was worth $744, which would have been very significant money for Joan, who was living paycheck to paycheck at the time. So Joan was working with the law clerk to build a case, a fraud case against her landlord, so she could prove to the OPP that her landlord had actually committed fraud and stolen her income tax check from her. The law clerk stated that Joan would show up to her office every few days to check up on how the paperwork was going and if the filing was done so that she could take it to the OPP. The law clerk said that the last time she saw Joan Lawrence was when she had actually completed the fraud case documents, and she gave it to Joan to give to the local OPP detachment. Many who knew Joan at this stage in her life would later add anecdotal evidence that she was very afraid and worried about the Laan siblings, or the Laan family, specifically Uncle Ron, who lived on the same property as her in the farmhouse. One of the people that knew Joan around this time was a lady named Linda Charbonneau. At the time, Linda worked as the deli manager at the local A&P that Joan would frequent. The pair had met because there was like this free coffee stand in the A&P that was beside the deli counter. So whenever Joan went to A&P, she would pick up a free coffee, and eventually Linda and Joan started talking whenever Joan would pick up a coffee there, and they became fast friends. Linda says that the pair bonded over their love of cats. Linda said that whenever she talked to Joan, Joan often seemed very worried and fearful about her current living conditions when Joan was living on the Laan family farm. Linda said that Joan had a space heater in her shed that was the only source of heat where Joan was living, and in the fall of 1998, the space heater had actually broken. And the landlord hadn't like supplied her with a new one or fixed it, so she was like basically freezing to death while winter was approaching. It gets very, very cold in the winter in Canada, so it wouldn't have been sustainable for Joan to live in a small area without any source of heat. It would have been very dangerous, essentially. Linda said that she also once saw Joan give a lot of money to a sort of creepy skinny man wearing a cowboy hat at the front cash registers at the A&P. This man was later identified to be Uncle Ron, so she was probably giving Uncle Ron rent or something at this time. Because he was identified as the man in this situation because Uncle Ron often wore a cowboy hat. Sadly, because Joan had no bathroom where she was living at the time on the Laan family property, she was sort of known around Huntsville for her poor hygiene. During one of their chats, Joan actually told Linda that her landlord, Uncle Ron, had offered like his bathroom inside the farmhouse for Joan to use for showers and just to like go to the bathroom, but Joan had refused because she was so afraid of Uncle Ron and didn't want to be alone in the house with him. So she refused to use the bathroom because she said she never knew what he would do to her. The last time that Linda saw Joan, sometime in fall 1998, Joan had actually asked Linda if she had received her 1997 income tax check because she was worried that her landlord had received it and cashed it. Because she hadn't received it yet, Linda said that she had received hers months prior, which seemed to worry Joan more about her situation. It also appeared that shortly before her disappearance, Joan had been asking literally everyone if they had a place for her to move into or a place that she could rent. This was extremely out of character for Joan because she never asked for help from anyone. A lot of people had offered Joan a place to move into or to live in the past, and she had refused, never seeming to want to burden anyone or take anyone's charity. But she was literally asking everyone. She even asked Linda, but Linda refused because Joan would have wanted to take her 30 plus cats to live with her, and Linda just couldn't handle that. So a lot of people were actually refusing Joan because of the cats. That is a big thing to take in. She had even asked an OPP officer who was driving her into town if she could stay in his parents' stable, his parents' small horse stable. She could rent that out. He had said no because there was no running water or heat source. Sometime within the first few weeks of the investigation into Joan's disappearance, the other tenant on the property, Alan Marshall, actually called Detective Aaron Burke to inform her that the last time he saw Joan, he also saw a backhoe being operated on the Laan family property later that same day in the evening. Alan Marshall also said that shortly after Joan's disappearance, he had heard that Joan's shed that she lived in or rented on the property was actually burnt down. Another witness actually came forward just in recent years and shared a similar story to Alan Marshall. The second witness was a man named Bob Earl who worked as a lumberjack, and in the year 1998 he actually lived across the street from the Laan farm property, so he knew of Joan and the people that lived there. Bob stated that early one morning in November 1998 he usually wakes up around 5 a.m., but around 7 a.m. he heard 2 gunshots ring out. He had binoculars, so after he heard the gunshots, he looked into his binoculars and saw 2 shadowy figures on the Laan farm property. It wasn't clear who these people actually were because Bob said it was a foggy day, so he couldn't identify them. Then he said he witnessed later around that same day, he witnessed 2 silhouettes burn down the small garden shed that Joan lived in, then clean up the mess with a backhoe. Then the silhouettes loaded the residue or the debris from the fire and the gunshots. They loaded it up in their truck and dumped it in a neighboring dumping site. Bob Earl said he witnessed 3 men dump on the neighboring property. This property was often used as a dumping site by locals in the area. He claimed that one of the men that was dumping was Uncle Ron, and then the 3 men were driving a dark blue Chev truck with a wooden side, and the car or the truck had no muffler or exhaust. Bob Earl said he didn't immediately report the sighting at the time because the area was often used as a dumping site, so it was nothing out of the ordinary for him. He didn't think it was significant enough or he had enough evidence to really bring it to the police. He ended up finally reporting the incident around a year later in 1999 after he was arrested for public intoxication. After being arrested, he talked to a local officer and told him what he had seen a year prior around the time that Joan Lawrence had disappeared, but he said that the police dismissed him at the time because he was a drunk. Around 7 weeks after Joan Lawrence was last seen, Detective Aaron had compiled enough evidence to get a search warrant for the Laan farm property. So Aaron and other officers actually executed the search warrant on December 17th, 1998. During the search, they weren't able to locate any of Joan's remains or her body, but they did come across 6 of Joan's cats who had sadly been shot dead with a rifle. I presume or really hope that the rest of Joan's cats sort of scurried off and ran away and lived out lovely lives. So that's what they discovered during their search. Prior to Joan's disappearance in the summer of 1998, OPP officers in Huntsville were actually receiving a lot of phone calls from concerned social workers and other helping professionals, most of which that lived in Toronto, who had worked or were working with individuals who had previously lived on one of the 3 Laan family properties. They were expressing concerns about the state of the living conditions on these properties and the poor care that residents and tenants were receiving. Specifically, Detective Rob Matthews, who is another significant OPP detective in this case, had been contacted by a social worker who had a client that they were working with named Joseph Paquin. Sorry, Joseph. Joseph had moved from Toronto to Muskoka in January 1998 to actually live on the Laan farm property where Joan and Alan Marshall also lived, but he lived or rented out a cabin on the property at the time. He said he paid $400 per month to rent out the small cabin, which at the time he was sharing with another elderly person. The social worker told Detective Rob Matthews that there was no running water on the property. Joseph had no access to a phone on the property in case of emergency, and that his diet was really poor. He was eating craft dinner for basically his 3 meals every day. So the conditions on the farm were so poor that Joseph eventually hitchhiked back to Toronto to live in a homeless shelter, which he had previously lived in before moving to Muskoka. After receiving the warning from the social worker, Detective Matthews was sufficiently concerned, so he decided to visit the Laan farm property on what is called a life safety inspection. A life inspection is an inspection of a property to ensure that the owner of the property is in compliance with safety standards. These inspections are made when there is a concern, when there's a child or a vulnerable adult, which is like a chronically ill adult, an elderly adult, or an adult with a disability. When there's concern that a child or a vulnerable adult is at risk living on this property, then a life safety inspection is done. In this case, Detective Matthews was aware that there were other vulnerable elderly people living on the Laan farm property. So under Canadian law, he was permitted to perform a life safety inspection on the property as long as he was accompanied by someone from the local fire department. So on September 4th, 1998, Detective Matthews and the Huntsville fire chief went to the Laan family property to inspect it. Once they arrived, Detective Matthews reported that there was a small garden shed located to the rear of the main farmhouse, which I said was the main residence on the property. Joan Lawrence came out of the shed, introduced herself, and invited the 2 men into her home, which was the garden shed. The fire chief and Detective Matthews tried to enter her small residence, but couldn't enter the shed because of the small the strong smell of cat urine. Detective Matthews would later report that Joan's shed contained a small bed that was covered with clothing that was piled really high, and then a small desk with a lamp on it. Then there was a hole that seemed to have been punched into one of the walls, where like an extension cord was sort of snaked through the hole. The extension cord was the thing that was giving electricity into the residence that powered the small space heater and the lamp. Detective Matthews also said that there was over 30 cats living in the shed, and that the floor of the shed was covered in a newspaper that was littered with cat excrement and pee-pee. Despite this, Joan was comfortable in the residence and walking around in bare feet. Joan informed Detective Matthews and the fire chief that she had been renting the property for $600 a month for around 2 years at that point. Matthews also said that he spoke to the property owner, which I'm unsure if he's talking about Uncle Ron or one of the Laan siblings at this point. There's no specification, but he talks to one of them about the conditions of the farm and the conditions that Joan was living in, so he expressed his concerns to them. I have a lozenge in my mouth, so sorry if you see that or hear that. My throat hurts from speaking. Anyways, so after this life safety inspection was done, the health inspector was contacted by police. So Detective Matthews and other authorities tried to actually return to the property to see how Joan was 2 days later, as her living conditions were like deplorable and they were going to remove her from the property. But someone, again, it's unclear who, actually told police and authorities that Joan had moved off the property in the last 2 days, and she was now living in a small town east of Muskoka. Authorities would later discover that this was a lie. Joan had not moved off the Laan farm property, but she had actually been moved to one of the abandoned vehicles that were on the property. So she had been moved to a 1972 Volkswagen van that had been abandoned on the property, where she would be living for the next 2 months up until her disappearance in November 1998. This was confirmed by the other resident or tenant on the farm property, Alan Marshall, who said that when police actually returned to the Laan farm property 2 days later, so around September 6th, Uncle Ron had taken Joan for a drive around Huntsville or whatever, so she wouldn't be there when police were there, so they would think she had, or it would add legitimacy to their story that she had moved off the property. Fast forward 2 months to when Joan was actually reported missing. Alan Marshall actually told Detective Aaron Burke, who was doing the investigation at the time, that after Joan's disappearance, the Laan siblings had entirely cleaned out the garden shed that Joan had lived in and burned all of Joan's clothing, which may have been the fire that Bob Earl saw in November. Alan also alleged that Uncle Ron had actually confessed to him that he was the one who shot 6 of Joan's cats with his own .22 caliber hunting rifle. Based on all this information, Detective Aaron Burke came to the conclusion and believed that Joan was murdered to, quote, prevent her from reporting frauds, thefts, mistreatment, and neglect by the Laan family. So who is the Laan family and the Laan siblings? There are 4 Laan siblings who are involved in this story, who were born to parents Anne and Shirley Laan. The couple actually had 7 children together, but 3 of the Laan siblings are completely not involved in this case. They're not relevant. They haven't done anything wrong. So the relevant Laan siblings to this case are David, Walter, Paul, and Catherine. The Laan siblings actually, or the Laan family actually grew up in Huntsville, and their family appeared pretty innocuous or inconspicuous and normal to other Huntsville residents. The siblings were raised as Christians and eventually became known for their kindness and charity for those in need. Their father, Laan, died unexpectedly in 1971 when he was only 33 years old. Laan was digging a well on the farm property, which is the property that Joan later lived on. So he was inside the well around 27 feet down digging when the top of the well allegedly collapsed on top of him. His brother-in-law, Ronald Atlan, who I refer to as Uncle Ron throughout this story, was also working on the well but wasn't harmed for some reason in the accident. Uncle Ron and Laan's sons, who were around 14 years old at the time, were the ones that dug through the rubble and actually recovered Laan's body. Laan was pronounced dead on arrival to the Huntsville hospital. An autopsy was never done on his body, but the coroner immediately closed the case, ruling it an accidental death. As young adults, the siblings went their separate ways for a while. So David and Laan moved to Toronto to go to college. Paul and Walter sort of co-owned and operated a contracting business together, and Catherine began working as a treasurer at the Muskoka Christian School. It also seems that the siblings sort of started their respective criminal careers early in their adulthood. Walter and David Laan were both convicted for breaking and entering. Additionally, Walter was convicted for impersonating a police officer. I don't know the details of this sort of arrest and conviction, but they were arrested. Catherine Laan also had her very own criminal career. According to the podcast I mentioned at the top, in the 1980s, she had been convicted of possession, theft, and extortion. In 1994, the four Laan siblings that are relevant to this story sort of reunited to open a series of Christian retirement homes. They opened their first care home that same year and called it the Cedar Pines Christian Retirement Home, and that was located in Elmsdale, Ontario. The second care home they opened was called Fern Glen Manor, which was originally located in Sprucedale, Ontario, then was later located in an area closer to Huntsville. The Laans sort of marketed these care homes as an extension of their godly charity work. The siblings were recruiting low-income seniors or chronically ill individuals who had no immediate family to take care of them. Catherine Laan once said that the people they were recruiting, including, paraphrase obviously, chronically ill adults and seniors, persons with disabilities, and adults struggling with alcohol and drug abuse. Thus, the Laan siblings, specifically, I think Walter and Paul, or Walter and David, started traveling to a hospital and men's homeless shelters in Toronto, Huntsville, and Burke Falls to recruit individuals that were living in these homeless shelters and hospitals to move into their care homes. When recruiting prospective residents, Paul and Walter Laan would pose as senior consultants and placement officers to make themselves seem more credible and actually gain access to the shelters and hospitals, though they had no accreditations that would actually make them these people. It has been reported that when the siblings were recruiting people from Toronto, they told prospective residents that their care homes were only 15 minutes away from Toronto, but in actuality, it was over 3 hours away. So the residents were misled into thinking that the care homes were close by, only to be picked up by one of the Laan siblings and driven 3 hours away to disgusting care home conditions. Similar to the disgusting Laan farm property, the conditions inside the Laan Christian retirement homes were also inhumane and disgusting. Contractor Jeff Vander Klot had been solicited or hired by Catherine Laan to work on Fern Glen Manor in 1996. He went to the home before accepting the job to sort of like quote what needed to be done and stuff, or see what what work Catherine wanted him to do, and was disgusted and shocked by what he saw. Jeff later said, quote, "The place was a disaster. I saw both elderly people and persons with disabilities playing cards in this tiny little smoke-filled room. There was a little fan going, but it wasn't even blowing. It was outside. And there wasn't really a finished room. There were just stud walls. None of them were well kept. They all looked dirty and wore old clothes. It was just a horrible place to spend your last few years, or however many years of your life." After seeing the conditions at Glen Manor, Jeff refused the job. It is also alleged that once new residents arrived at the two care homes, they were forced to sign over a power of attorney to the Laan siblings, and the phones were locked in an office so they couldn't access them and call anyone for help or to pick them up. A pastor who lived in Muskoka later verified these claims, saying that he had visited Glen Manor to sign and validate documents, but he was disturbed when he found out that a lot of the forms or documents looked to be pre-signed by residents. These pre-signed documents included forms that gave Walter Laan permission to access and change the residents' bank accounts, so their checks would essentially be directly deposited to him every month. The pastor refused to sign and validate these documents because he felt that many of the residents didn't have the cognitive capacity to know what they were signing. Additionally, the people who actually worked in the Laan care homes were grossly underqualified. They would essentially just hire family, friends, or acquaintances. Even their mother Shirley worked at one of the care homes at some point, and they would give them positions that they weren't qualified to take. Obviously, this led to a poor care of the residents. Throughout this time, Catherine Laan was still working as the treasurer for the Muskoka Christian School, but it was then discovered that she had stolen around $30,000 from the school by writing checks to the Cedar Pines Christian Home or just to herself and cashing them. When this was discovered, the OPP, including Detective Rob Matthews, conducted a criminal investigation against her in the fall of 1996, and she was eventually convicted of fraud and theft. As part of the investigation into Joan's disappearance and the constant concerns about the care and condition of residents who lived on one of the Laan family's 3 properties, which included the farm, Cedar Pines, and Glen Manor, Detectives Aaron and Matthews visited Glen Manor on January 28th, 1998 to interview residents and just see the conditions. Like I said, during this visit, detectives interviewed residents of the care home, most of which expressed that they actually wanted to leave the care home. When detectives told them that they were legal adults and could leave the property at any time, most of them basically expressed that they wanted to get out of there right away. The 2 most significant residents that were interviewed at Glen Manor were Ralph Grant and Eric Laan. Eric Laan was the Laan siblings' paternal grandfather, so he was Aan Laan's father, which is Aan is the father of the Laan siblings. During the visit, Eric told detectives that his son Aan's death, which if you recall is when Aan died in a well, so Eric told detectives that Aan's death wasn't an accident, that Aan had actually been struck in the back of the head, which is what caused his death. I believe police investigated these claims, but it's unclear if anything came out of it. Nothing has been published or reported to the public, so nothing's been released, but there are reports that there was never an autopsy done by a coroner on Aan's body, so this could be possible in my opinion. Sadly, Eric passed away in 2003, so we still don't know what happened to Aan. but it's still very interesting to note in my opinion. Then the detectives also met a man named Ralph Grant, who was a 69-year-old resident at Fern Glen Manor. Shortly after the detectives' visit to Fern Glen Manor, Ralph went missing, though this wouldn't be noticed by police until November 2000 because of the Laan's misleading and lies. Meanwhile, in the wake of the police investigation into the Laan siblings started to sell off their 3 properties. By the beginning of February 1999, they had sold their last property, which was Fern Glen Manor, and all the Laan siblings and Uncle Ron immediately dispersed and left the Muskoka area. The residents of the care homes were all sent away to different places, but nobody could locate where Ralph Grant had gone after the closure of Fern Glen Manor. Ralph Grant was born in Nova Scotia on May 26, 1926. He was known by the nicknames either Duke or Dougie. He was interviewed by police, as I said, in January 1999. During this interview, he told police that he had 3 siblings, but at the time he did not know where they were living. His siblings were allegedly 2 brothers and a sister. In his adult life, Ralph actually worked in manufacturing. One of his family members, a man named Howard Grant, recalled that Ralph always had an amazing memory, but Howard said that Ralph eventually became estranged from his family because of his struggles with alcoholism. Later in his life, Ralph was sadly diagnosed with cancer. Throughout his battle, the cancer ate away at his jaw, so Ralph had to wear a prosthetic jaw. The last time Ralph's estranged family actually saw him was shortly after his jaw surgery when he was recovering, which was probably sometime in the late 1980s, as Ralph had began receiving a disability pension for his condition in 1988. Ralph had been actually living in a homeless shelter in Toronto when he was recruited by one of the Laan siblings to move to Muskoka to live in Fern Glen Manor. It is believed he actually moved to Muskoka sometime in 1996. When Fern Glen Manor was sold and closed in early February 1999, police were told that Ralph and other residents had been moved to the private residence of Fern Glen Manor's former manager, which was a lady named Melina Simic. Upon further investigation, police discovered that Ralph actually never lived with Melina Simic, so it is believed that Ralph went missing sometime between his interview on January 28th and February 22nd, 1999. As police were investigating more into the Laan family and their care homes, they actually discovered that 2 more elderly men were missing. These men were actually discovered before Ralph Grant. Ralph Grant was the 4th and final person that was discovered missing. But this meant that there was now 4 missing people, missing seniors associated with the Laan family. These missing persons were all discovered around 2 years after, or within 2 years after Joan's disappearance, but all 4 went missing within a year of each other. Another one of the missing seniors was a man named John Croft. John Croft had at least 1 sibling, which was a sister named Barbara. Barbara and John's father worked as a machine operator and their mother waitressed at the Royal York Hotel growing up. Growing up, Barbara said that John liked to fish and play hockey, and his family would often picnic in a local park. As an adult, John took a job working as a shoe salesman at Eaton's, which is a now defunct department store. Barbara says that John was always a good brother to her, but he started struggling really badly with his mental health, which caused a lot of stress and tension within their family. He was diagnosed with manic depression, which is now known as a bipolar disorder. Barbara said that John's mental health concerns caused him to have outbursts, which eventually caused him to become estranged from his family, including his sister Barbara. Barbara always thought that her brother was safe. She was under the impression that John was living at a long-term care home facility in Toronto that was called Spencer House. Barbara said the last time she saw her brother was in 1996 at their mother's funeral, and then the last time she heard from her brother was later that same year in the spring when he called her to ask if she knew his bank account PIN. It is believed that in 1997, John Croft started living in Fern Glen Manor under the care of the Laan siblings, and it is believed that he went missing sometime between February to March 1998 when he was last seen. He was 71 years old at the time of his disappearance. The fourth missing senior that I'm going to talk about is John Assemple. Little is known about John Assemple's life, sadly. It is known that Assemple was born in Derry, Ireland. He worked in a brickyard there until he eventually moved to Canada. When he moved to Canada, he got married and had a son named James. It appears that Assemple eventually became estranged from his family for unknown reasons, since he has not seen his son James since James was 15 years old. It is believed that Assemple had started living at Fern Glen Manor shortly before his disappearance between January to March 1998, so around the same time as John Croft. He had been recruited by the Laan siblings when he was also living in a homeless shelter in Toronto. He was 91 years old at the time of his disappearance. These three men, Ralph Grant, John Croft, and John Assemple, have never been reported missing by the Laan family, who should have been the ones reporting him missing because they were under their care. In fact, in the case of Ralph Grant, police had actually been misled by the Laans about where he was living, leading them to believe that Ralph was still alive and well when he was most likely dead. After realizing that these three men were missing and investigating into their disappearances, police found out that their pension checks were still being cashed. So this is just a side story. A former resident of both Cedar Pines and Fern Glen Manor informed police that his mother had met with a young couple who was later identified to be Catherine and Walter Laan. So that's pretty gross that they're siblings and pretending to be a couple. But they met with his mother when he was receiving surgery for his ulcer. I guess his mother agreed for him to move into one of the care homes of the Laans because he started living there shortly afterwards, and he became a resident of Cedar Pines in May 1996. He stated that within 6 months of living there, the Laans forced him to sign over his power of attorney to Paul Laan, and they destroyed his bank card. He also said that his disability checks were directly deposited into the Cedar Pines bank account. This former resident also stated that the Laans had taken one of his income tax checks because, quote, he was late on rent payments. Based on this former resident's admission and several others, and the case of pension checks of the 3 missing men still being cashed after their disappearances, police arrested Walter Laan's wife Karen for fraud over $5,000 in January 2001. Police had been told that Karen was the one that completed the resident's income tax, which is why she was arrested first, as the fraud was initially linked to her. Eventually, police uncovered at least 7 former residents, including the 3 missing men, of the Laan's care homes that had been defrauded of their Canadian pension, old age security, income tax checks, and other benefits. Thus, all 4 siblings involved in the care homes were charged in 2002, and it is alleged that in a total, the Laan siblings have or had defrauded or stolen at least $120,000 from former and current residents. Unfortunately, the charges against David and Karen Laan were eventually dropped for reasons that have never been made public, but the remaining 3 Laan siblings, Catherine, Paul, and Walter, all pled guilty and were each given a conditional sentence of 9 months for their crime. Having been pretty successful in implicating the Laans in their financial scams, the OPP continued to try to get the Laans to confess to or implicate themselves in the deaths or disappearances of the 4 missing seniors. They really wanted to discover where their bodies had been disposed, because by the mid-2000s, they still hadn't done this. So neither discovering the bodies or implicating the 4 Laan siblings and Uncle Ron in the deaths or disappearances of the 4 missing seniors, neither of these have happened as of yet, so 2021. So without any further convictions into the disappearances or murders, the Laans went on to live their lives in the 2000s. Catherine, Walter, and Paul Laan were all released from jail sometime in 2003. After they served their time, the 4 siblings and creepy Uncle Ron went their separate ways. So now I'm just going to go over where they went after this. So Paul and his wife Letitia ended up moving to Seoul, South Korea in 2006, where they both received their master's in Christian education by 2014 and started teaching at a private Christian university in Seoul called Samayuk University. So sorry for butchering that. I'm uncultured. Paul lost his teaching job in Seoul after a Korean news agency discovered the accusations that he was maybe involved in the 4 disappearances and deaths of 4 seniors in Canada, and that he had been previously convicted of actually defrauding seniors. So this news agency brought all this information to Paul's employer, and Paul was immediately fired. After Paul lost his job, Letitia and Paul returned to Canada. After returning to Canada, Paul became a regular at a Seventh-day Adventist church that was located in Toronto and started his old routine of trying to defraud elderly people shortly afterwards. It is alleged that he began befriending elderly congregators at the church and then started asking them for money. He said that he needed the money to continue his missionary work. Members of the church eventually started giving Paul money, and it is alleged that he received around $10,000 from them. After receiving this money, Paul went away and never returned to the church. Then there was Miss Catherine Laan. She married a man who lived in Oregon in America named Ron Ezert in 1998. 8, she eventually moved to America to be with him for a while. In the 2000s, presumably after her release from jail, she took a teaching job at a private school in Barrie, Ontario. The school was located in a Seventh-day Adventist church, and Catherine started using her married name while working there, so Catherine Ezert. But the school eventually closed down after major media attention about the Laan's case and the fact that Catherine was working there. To allegedly hide from the public scrutiny, Catherine started living under different variations of her name and moving around a lot. The podcast reported that by 2017, Catherine had used at least 9 variations of her name and had at least 8 different recorded addresses. At one point, Catherine even entered the world of naturopathy. She claimed she was a doctor of naturopathy and called herself Dr. Karen Smith. Catherine was never registered with the College of Naturopaths in Ontario, so she had no accreditations to actually use this title. So eventually her marriage dissolved, although I don't know when or why. And then Catherine started dating a man named Gary Smith, who was 17 years her senior. Gary was actually married to a woman named Earl at the time that he met Catherine. They met because they lived beside each other. Earl, who is aware of Catherine's history, is concerned or was concerned that Catherine was going to take advantage of Gary. He sort of fit her MO since he was a senior who was receiving a pension and other financial benefits. Catherine was reportedly diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer sometime in the late 2010s, and she passed away in July 2019 when she was in her mid-50s. Next Laan sibling I'm going to be talking about is, of course, Walter Laan, who continued his criminal activity after he was released from jail in 2004. Shortly after he was released, he committed a series of armed robberies on the homes of elderly people in 2005. Walter's victims were primarily elderly women, except for one elderly man who he actually groped during the armed robbery. One of his victims, an elderly woman, testified that Walter broke into her house, then bound her wrists and ankles with black tape and left her in her bedroom while he robbed her. He also told her she had nice breasts. For his armed robberies, Walter was sentenced to 11 years in prison. He was released in 2013, and shortly after that, he started working with his brother David Laan in Toronto. This segues me into talking about the fourth and final involved Laan sibling, which is David Laan, who also continued his criminal career. He was convicted for breaking and entering after he tried to break into a hospital to steal drugs, which he planned on selling. Additionally, a man named John Morgan told police, I believe sometime in the early 2000s, that he actually was acquaintances with David because they were both members of the Nationalist Party of Canada, which is a far right group known for promoting white supremacy and for being really racist. The last that was known about David was that he was married with children. He's living well in Toronto, and he works or was working as a technologist at George Brown College and working a side business with his brother Walter, which is Esto Gas Services, which is sort of a myriad of like contracting stuff. As for creepy Uncle Ron, apparently he has been keeping a low profile, constantly traveling and moving around to evade police. Police have still not arrested anyone in relation to the disappearances and potential murders / deaths of the 4 missing seniors, and they still haven't uncovered their remains. So the picture about what truly happened to Joan Lawrence, John Croft, John Semple, and Ralph Grant is unknown to this day. Here is what we do know. All 4 Laan siblings and Uncle Ron had contact with Joan Lawrence or was associated with Joan Lawrence. Catherine had acquainted herself with Joan and eventually convinced her to move into one of the care homes where she lived in the attic for some time. Eventually, she complained that she couldn't afford the rent, so Catherine moved her to the Laan farm property where she paid $600 in rent to live in a small garden shed. After becoming a tenant for the land, David Laan gained access to Joan's money by making her bank account a joint bank account with him. David was also the one who charged her rent monthly, so he took $600 out of her account monthly to live in the shed. Paul told authorities that he was a Joan's accountant, though it's unclear what he's talking about because he's not an accountant. It is also clear that Joan was afraid of the Laans, specifically Uncle Ron, who lived near her in the farmhouse. She made this clear to multiple people. She also had a P.O. box in town, so in Huntsville, that she hid and never told the Laans about because she was fearful that they were going to take her checks and cash them, so she didn't want her mail to come directly to the Laan farm property. The main theory is that Joan Lawrence was murdered by David Laan and Uncle Ron in early November 1998 because they were made aware that Joan was going to report or had reported the Laans for stealing her 1997 income tax check. It is alleged that she was either disposed of on or near the Laan farm property because of the backhoe sightings. They believe the backhoe sightings were them disposing of her body. For the other 3 missing men, it is theorized that their deaths were most likely accidental, caused by the poor conditions and care from the retirement homes by the land. So they may not have intentionally killed the 3 men, but their deaths still could have been attributed to the lands because of the poor conditions. They could have been charged with neglect or unintentional manslaughter or whatever it's called. So it is believed that they potentially covered up the deaths of John Semple, John Croft, and Ralph Grant and never reported it to the authorities to prevent their implication in the death. However, it is still an ongoing case and police haven't released any new information in over a decade about what may have happened to the 4 missing persons. They did confirm in 2007 that all 4 seniors were believed to be dead. On July 25th, 2019, the OPP held a press conference about the case in Vaughan, Ontario. The case manager, who is currently Detective Rob Matthews, spoke briefly about the case. He said that they were close to arrests, but they needed more witnesses and testimony / evidence to come forward before they could go forward with the arrest. The only real new information that Rob Matthews gave was that the authorities believed that Joan Lawrence had actually been murdered on the Laan farm property, and that all alive members of the Laan family are still currently living in Ontario and are still working with elderly people, which is very scary to think about. It's horrifying to me that the Laan siblings and Uncle Ron made a career out of preying on the most vulnerable members of society. They allowed these people to live in disgusting conditions and framed it as charity work or doing it out of the goodness of their own hearts. But they were just trying to steal and exploit seniors, chronically ill people, and persons with disabilities so they could make a quick buck off of them. I do hope that arrests are made soon and the public especially the families of the 4 missing persons, receive answers about what happened to Joan Lawrence, John Croft, John Semple, and Ralph Grant. If you have any information about this case, please call 1-877-934-6363. If you live in Canada, or if you live outside of Canada, call 1-704-330-4144. You can also email your info to opp.isb.resolve@opp.ca. Thank you for watching.